everybody, and welcome to the NAESP Principal Podcast. My name is Liz Gooden. I am the proud principal of the Henry P. Clough Elementary School in Mendon, Massachusetts, and I also am happy to be serving as an NAESP Fellow for the Center for Innovative Leadership. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-fellow.
Hey everybody, Scott McLeod. I'm Professor of Educational Leadership at the University of Colorado, Denver. And actually super delighted to have our guest with us today. Thank you, Dr. Mark Gooden. He is the Christian Johnson Endeavor Professor of Educational Leadership and Chair of the Department of Organization Leadership at Teachers College, Columbia University. That's a big mouthful, and Mark and I have known each other a really long time, and we're super happy to have him on the podcast. So, Mark, we don't have a lot of time, so we're just going to dive right in with question number one for you. So NAESP recently updated its statement of ethics for school administrators. Editor-in-Chief Kaylin Tucker asked education leaders like yourself to address some ethical leadership concerns according to their specific lenses. Talk to us a little bit about the intersection of ethics and culturally responsive leadership.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Scott and Liz, and thank you for the question. So yes. So I love this question, actually. And when I think about ethical leadership, I mean, there are a lot of ways to define it. But in the article, I talk about three attributes: strength, courage, and kindness. We've been hearing a lot about kindness, so I'll kind of leave that one for the last point. But I see strength for leaders as a way, as an attribute to be strong and vulnerable at the same time. You know, certainly to be committed to doing great leadership work, but also showing vulnerability when it comes to doing culturally responsive work is really quite necessary. So it's one of those things where we ask leaders to do things like reflect on your critical consciousness. And by that, we mean, and I tend to mean this idea of really considering how our great country has developed around certain inequities, historical ones, structural ones, and also institutional inequities. And so for leaders to be aware of that, they have to have a certain degree of critical consciousness. So that's where those two pieces kind of interplay together. When we're thinking about strength, when we think about courage, you really have to be bold enough to be vulnerable. And sometimes people think about courage as being this thing where I'm the person without fear. And I tend to think about people with courage actually have fear, but have a greater drive to pull them forward. And so being an ethical leader and knowing that I have to do what's right is a way of really drawing on that courage, even though you may be afraid, or even though you may be a little somewhat nervous about what's going to happen. I've seen some of the most impressive leaders say, you know, I did what I had to do, and people came to my aid and said, wow, and there's this new research out about when leaders show up, and when they're ethical, when they do the right thing, it's experienced as an event of awe-inspiring. People see it as, wow, I want to be like that. I want to do what they're doing. And so they tend to come up and say, I can't do it exactly like you, but you've inspired me in a way to do something that's really worthwhile. So when we think about being a culturally responsive leader, having that critical consciousness requires courage, saying that we're going to develop teaching that's going to see students, that's going to be about being culturally responsive pedagogy and how we support students. That again takes courage, because you're going to challenge teachers to think differently about their work and expand it if they have not heretofore been exposed to that. Excuse me.
Awesome. And you know what, as listening to you, I should have worn, I have my Be Brave earrings. I'm known for lots of different statement earrings, and that is my favorite pair, because exactly what you just said about how as leaders we absolutely need to, you know, show up and be brave. So, you know, I know you just shared a great article in the latest Principal magazine about when the fight for equity becomes an ethical dilemma. And you give us a working definition of equity leadership. And I personally love the example. I'm all about culture responsive literacy. So, you know, your example about the story with the principal and the teacher with around the book Ghost Boys, and you know, when they face the backlash to curriculum choices. So what encouragement do you have for us principals who are facing these challenges? Because I know that so many leaders are every day facing these challenges.
Yes, yes. Well, Liz, well, thank you for wearing those earrings and calling it to my attention. So I believe that for leaders, it comes down to this idea that they really are charged with doing the right thing when it comes to students. Leaders, I think, who started out, I generally think of them as educators. Uh, Chances are, if they have an ethical focus, they're on the right side of history. If you think nationally what's going on in this country, some of us are some of your listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with the Office of Civil Rights. And we will know that the complaints in the last fiscal year 22 have been up, almost 19,000 complaints from the Office of Civil Rights across different types of Title VI and Title IX discrimination, right? Discrimination against kids based on their ability. So when we start to think about what that means, leaders have, I think, an ethical responsibility to say, hey, look, this is what's happening in schools. And in order to avoid people really making mistakes that are careless, we have to bring a certain degree of awareness to this. We have to say, okay, there is the Title VI Act, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, beyond that procedural law and what's required, we've got to help folks understand, how do we create a welcoming and affirming environment? And we talk about that in culturally responsive school leadership. How do we make sure that students who've been historically marginalized feel welcome? How do they see themselves, as a part of the curriculum? And so when we start to do that for the most marginalized students, we find that, other students are watching what we do, and other students are also interested. And once again, going back to being leaders themselves and recognizing when we have issues, like bullying, for instance. People recognize, and we've all been educators, and I can honestly say, when we saw students being bullied, or we had some evidence of that happening, it didn't start just with that one incident. It oftentimes started with some kind of inappropriate language that was used in the class, something that was said about this student or that student that we didn't attend to. We said, okay, you can't say that here, but we didn't sit down and maybe take the time to say, this is why we can't do this, because history teaches us that when we allow certain types of language to go forward, it creates a space, it creates an environment where it becomes easier for people to start to launch hate speech, for instance, or to start to, smack kids or hit kids because you're like this and you're that particular kind of kid. And so the Office for Civil Rights reminds us that we have to be aware of those things. And hopefully they won't show up on our doorstep with a complaint. But again, we have a chance to be aware of that, and ethical leaders can do that ahead of time and be proactive in that space.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Listeners, one of the things we didn't mention is that Mark is also the co-author of a absolutely fantastic book called 5 Practices for Equity-Focused School Leadership. So definitely a book you should consider putting on your bookshelf. Mark, your conversation reminds me of another well-known ethics book in school leadership from Shapiro and Stefkovich, where one of the things they talk about is this idea of an ethic of critique, which invites us to sort of zoom up and ask ourselves some really difficult questions as school leaders and preparation programs about how rules and policies are made, who benefits, who has power, whose voices are privileged or silenced, and so on. As you think about your own work there at Teachers College at Columbia University, what are you learning are some of the most common voids or barriers or challenges as we think about really leaning heavily into culturally responsive leadership, and some of the ethical challenges go with those?
Yeah. Thank you for the plug for the book, Scott, and thank you for that great question. So the interesting thing about working with leaders is they're like everybody else when it comes to this, right? So we bring this stuff up. We say, okay, we're going to be dealing with this idea of racial inequity. And we've become more skilled at using that as a term, as an entryway into it, because when we say race and racism, people get all crazy. But okay, we can say racial inequity and we can help people define what that is. But when we enter that conversation, what we find is most people want to find the culprit, reform the culprit, reform that person, and then move on. Most people are looking for the person who's doing it out there. And I'm pointing my fingers for people, really recognizing we're on a podcast. But they fail to recognize when you're pointing out, those three fingers that are pointing back at you, like, oh, wait, you mean I have a role in this? There's something that I can do that's best for kids that's going to involve me asking my own self and going through my own process of developing my racial awareness and recognizing that I have some issues and I've got to be brave in this. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the powerful thing that we really present in the book is, if you do this as a leader, and going back to what I said earlier, show that vulnerability up front, people become more willing to say, hey, I'm open to now doing a racial reflection. If you do that and share your racial reflection, because one of the things I like to say is, by doing that, it's like opening up your closet, right? It's like doing a 360 on leadership. It's like, hey, come on in, folks, take a look at all my baggage. Take a look at what I've been through, and so that you'll know that I'm not the principal on high and mighty on the hilltop, and I got here, I woke up here. No, I had to have some developmental steps to get here, but I've grown from those, and I want you to know that I'm still growing, and I want to grow with you so we can grow together and then co-develop what's going to be really what's best for our students. So starting with self is really powerful, and then recognizing that in order to do the best for people sometimes requires me to go out there and lead by doing the paradoxical thing of saying, I'm not going to be the person who's leading from the top or leading from the, however you want to say that. But I like to use this idea, lead in a circle. And then if you must think about yourself at the top of the circle, that's fine, over time. But if you're leading with the circle, that means any person there can think differently about how they lead and how they can offer something there that's really going to be substantial to the process. And by the way, it takes a lot more pressure off you as the leader, than having to think about coming up with all the answers.
Thank you. And I feel like you've started to get into some of this, but in terms of when thinking about being a culture responsive leader, it's I know with many different leaders that I've talked with, my own work doing it myself, it's challenging. There's and sometimes anxiety producing. But what are some common pitfalls that you see for principals in their work with teachers and staff in terms of being a culture responsive leader?
Yes, I did start to move in that direction, Liz. So yes, one common pitfall I would say is how we start to collect the data around what's happening in our school. A number of people talk about going through a process of doing an equity audit. I would just remind leaders that yes, that is a great thing to do, but there's also a big how in how there. Conduct the audit, but make sure that it's done in a way that you have a group of people who are supporting you in the process, who are participating along the way, maybe leading parts of it. There's an old saying that people don't argue with their own data, but it can be dangerous if you just give them the data and say, this is it. And, it's all about what you all are doing. No, I think take some really thoughtful steps in considering what we want to work on, kind of thinking about this as a mini needs assessment, if you will, pinpointing what we're going to do in a realistic way, not something that's too small. You have to kind of think about how I develop SMART goals. That may, as a guide, that will be helpful. But do that in cooperation with people. In the book, we talk about developing the equity leadership team. And that's a way of really creating a strong group of people who can support you in the work, but can also remind you of going back to, we're doing this in a certain kind of way that's going to bring as many people as possible on board. Not everybody, of course, not initially. And then one other thing I'll say related to that is, because we don't do this work nearly enough in schools, and I would love to see more of it and see us be more intentional about it. But until that day comes, there's going to be a great deal of resistance. There's some resistors, so to speak, and I use that label loosely, who are not going to be on board. They're just not going to be with this, and you're going to have to find ways to, move those people out to space and help them find another place to go. But there are some folks that we sometimes label as resistors too early, and we push them out, right? Recognizing this is difficult content. Many folks are openly suspicious about it because we have not had a chance to engage with the work. So we have to give it a chance, and we have to recognize we have to educate those folks. So a mistake might be saying all these people are against it, when in fact they may just be asking questions that can make us better, and it could be coming from a good place. And so we have to give ourselves time to recognize if in fact it is that, or if it's more the former that I've just described.
Thank you, Mark. I just finished reading Fix Injustice, Not Kids by Gorski and Swalwell. And I think you're echoing a lot of the themes that I really took away from that book around focusing on processes and structures, and most important, an equity culture, right? Like, this is not just an issue for particular individuals. This is really, an entire school culture and climate concern, and we have to really pay attention to all that. So thank you for reminding us of those bigger picture things that we have to enable as leaders, rather than just focusing on individuals. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to go in a slightly different direction here for this last one. NAESP also serves assistant principals, and as we know, APs are often responsible for student discipline. How do we better support APs and all school leaders, actually, as we think about leveraging restorative practices within those disciplinary conversations?
Yes. So there's so much in this question, right? And we have to get it out there beyond this, that joke, that thing about, I think somebody even has a book out called Beyond Books, Butts, and Buses, right? Which is a funny title, even without the alliteration. But I do believe there's some truth in how we think about our APs, right? As, well, not just truth, there's research that supports this, as disciplinarians, right? And also as doing kind of the grunt work, or the things that we don't want to do. Maybe principals are not as interested in doing, or that they need support on, which is totally understandable. We totally get it. But I would love for us to think about envisioning that assistant principalship as a person who is on that leadership team and responsible for restorative practices. So part of this is we've got to let go of our old habit of holding so tightly on our current system of a way of disciplining students, right? So if we say we're going to do restorative practices, and I know I have a colleague, who some colleagues who've done work on this, and finding that disparities sometimes remain, racial disparities remain even after folks have implemented restorative practices. But wouldn't it be a great thing to give an assistant principal the opportunity to implement restorative practices, one, with fidelity, right? Not just say we're doing it, because teachers are smart enough to say, wait, look, I didn't have any training. What is it? What are we doing? What is the stuff about circle? Like, people just throwing it out there saying we're now doing restorative practices. But have a couple of assistant principals lead that. Wouldn't that be wonderful to do that and implement it with fidelity, one. And two, think about that issue of how we have to bring restorative practices in a space where it is race conscious. We cannot have approaches to addressing discipline that are not race conscious. Why do I say that? Because again, if we go back to the Office of Civil Rights and the OCR data, for decades, it is shown, and people know this. And I've just come from, Scott, you remember the Education Law Association. We just did a talk, and this came up in our panel. We've known for decades that those disparities are there, and it's time for us to say we cannot implement anything, and I'm talking about the racial disparities, right? The situation where African-American students making up a small portion of the population, but being 3 times as likely to be suspended. We have to have a race-conscious approach. But wouldn't it be wonderful to have assistant principals who could take the lead on that, and other, I believe, creative problems within the education environment that gets them beyond the butts, books, and buses kind of thing, so that they can see the job as a pathway to leadership. And my last point, I'll say, we did an interview of some of our graduates from our program who have been really deeply entrenched in anti-racist leadership and doing this great work. And then it went into these roles as assistant principals, which is a great place to start. And they were really reluctant because they wanted to maintain the relationships on one hand and try to continue to progress. But on another hand, they were seeing some really troubling racial inequities in ways that they could support the principal, but they didn't have an actual pathway in the support to do it without worrying about whether, they'd be open and so on and so forth.
Oh my goodness. Well, that was a lot in a short amount of time, but I just want to say again, Mark, thank you so much for joining us today. I feel like I could, I want to keep having more conversation with you. I'm hoping that we will include, with the podcast, information for people to be able to reach out and connect with you if they want to, if they just want to speak more with you. And if you haven't read Mark's article in Principal Magazine, you definitely want to check that out as a starting point. Then you can go and check out his book. I will just end by saying, thank you again for joining us. And I think back to the story I said about, and what you just shared in your last answer, that, it's really easy for me to wear earrings that say "Be brave," or to, for us to talk about culture, being a culture responsive leader. It's much harder to actually do all that work. So thank you for laying the groundwork for us and really pushing us to, I think, dig deep and focus on equity. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Liz. And thank you all for having me. It's been, fantastic and fast. Hopefully we got all the questions answered like we needed to, and looking forward to connecting with people and just a really short, I can be found at goodenphd.com, and same thing on Twitter. I think it's at goodenphd, and Twitter, and then Instagram, same handle, at goodenphd. So it's pretty simple.
Awesome.
If you're just into the old-fashioned finding the website, sending me an email. I still answer those as well. So we'd love to hear from folks.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us here on the NAESP Principal Podcast. And we look forward to future podcasts to speak with more amazing educational leaders across the country.